In March of 1953, an old woman lay dying at Marlborough House, and her last instruction was that her own death must not be allowed to delay her granddaughter's coronation. She put this in her will. She was 85, confined to bed for a month with a gastric illness, her heart weakening by the day. She died in her sleep at 20 minutes past 10 on the night of 24 March. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II went ahead 10 weeks later on 2nd June. She didn't see it. For 60 years, she had been the most formidable woman in Britain, the queen who stood immovable when her son threw away a throne for an American divorcée, the consort who steadied a terrified second son and made him a king. The newsreels called her stately. The aristocracy called her something quieter, behind their hands. They learned never to let her admire anything they owned, because admiration, from Queen Mary, was a demand. And on the Sandringham estate, in a farmhouse kept back from the main house, there had once been a small boy, her youngest, who had his fits where the public couldn't see them, who was visited just enough to satisfy duty, and who died at 13 in a room most of the country never knew existed. This is the story of the matriarch the monarchy couldn't have survived without, and the price the people closest to her paid for that strength. This is who Queen Mary really was. Her full name was Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes of Teck. Born on 26 May 1867 at Kensington Palace, in the same room where Queen Victoria had been born 48 years before. Her father was Francis, Duke of Teck, whose morganatic descent from the Duke of Württemberg made him royal enough to move in royal circles, but not royal enough to hold any dynastic rank of his own. No succession rights, no independent income of substance. He depended entirely on crown generosity. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was the grandchild of George III, warm, sociable, and catastrophically extravagant, known, without much affection, as Fat Mary. The family's total income ran to roughly £9,000 a year, between a parliamentary annuity and her mother's contributions. By aristocratic standards, that was near poverty. By royal standards, it was humiliation. White Lodge in Richmond Park, granted rent-free by Queen Victoria, was the family's main residence. The debts accumulated regardless. By 1883, when Princess May was 16, the creditors could wait no longer. The family departed for Florence under financial pressure, remaining abroad for approximately 2 years, living cheaply among the expatriate community, managing creditors at a distance. They returned to England in 1885. The exile was the making of her. The contrast between her mother and herself is the origin of the machine. Mary Adelaide's warmth produced the financial chaos. Her daughter's response was the opposite. Rigid economy, controlled emotion, nothing wasted, nothing exposed. She watched what vulnerability cost. A family that couldn't pay its debts lost its dignity. An outsider among royals, tolerated but not fully admitted, learns very early that to show need is to invite contempt. Mabel, Countess of Airlie, who served as one of her ladies-in-waiting for decades, noted plainly that she didn't find it easy to express her emotions. The Countess was also the most perceptive witness to what that restraint actually cost. The tragedy was that neither had any understanding of a child's mind. She was 24 and recently returned to English society when Queen Victoria's eldest grandson, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, proposed to her. The engagement was announced on 3 December 1891. 6 weeks later, on 14 January 1892, Albert Victor died at Sandringham House, aged 28, of pneumonia following influenza. He had been considered, among those who knew him well, somewhere between intellectually limited and outright dissolute. The Dowager Duchess of Devonshire told Pope Hennessy, with the candor of advanced age, that he was a mental deficient, and added as an afterthought that he had been very amiable. nothing against him. For the dynasty, his death was a mercy. For Princess May, it was a more complicated transaction. On what would have been her wedding day, 27 February 1892, she wrote in her diary, "A very sad one for me, for it was to have been our wedding day." She kept the entry. Decades later, as an elderly queen, she annotated it again. The memory stayed. But whether grief or relief predominated, the institutional logic was already at work. Queen Victoria made her preference clear. George proposed in May 1893. They married on 6th July 1893 at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. She had been transferred from one prince to another with the smooth efficiency of a dynastic arrangement. She understood it entirely. She complied entirely. When Pope Hennessy's unpublished research notes later recorded her private admission to a lady of the bedchamber that she had come to realize she got the better brother, the remark carried a resignation that isn't quite the same thing as happiness. That marriage produced 6 children in 11 years. Edward arrived on 23 June 1894 at White Lodge, Richmond Park. Albert followed on 14 December 1895 at York Cottage, Sandringham. Then Mary, then Henry, then George. The 6th child, John, was born on 25 July 1905, also at York Cottage. A family photograph from 1910 shows all 6 children arranged together: Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, George, and John. The youngest already visibly set apart from the composition. 6 children in a household that neither parent was built for intimacy. The received account of the George V nursery, strict, formal, conducted mainly by nannies and tutors rather than parents, isn't a myth or a later editorial. It's documented across multiple independent sources. George V acknowledged, in a formulation his children's generation recorded and multiple biographers preserved, that he intended his children to be frightened of him, as he had been frightened of his own father. Pope Hennessy concluded that the king had a repressive effect on his wife, as well as on his children. Albert, the future George VI, developed a severe stammer from around age 6, attended speech therapy with the Australian therapist Lionel Logue from the 1920s onward, and suffered from chronic stomach problems and painful corrective splints for his knees. Contemporaneous understanding attributed the stammer partly to the emotional pressures of the household. Modern assessment makes causation multifactorial, but the anxious domestic atmosphere isn't in dispute. Mary's failure was different from her husband's. He was the source of the harshness. She was the woman who didn't counterbalance it. Mabel, Countess of Airlie, wrote that Mary grew to love her children when they were older, but was prevented by her public life from maintaining close contact. A harder reading. She interpreted her adult children's emotional needs through the lens of duty, and when they expressed distress, her response was most often hurt pride rather than comfort. Edward VIII documented the emotional distance in his 1951 memoir, A King's Story: the formal household, the inspections, the discouragement of outward affection. He later told Pope Hennessy that his mother had been a cold woman who wouldn't talk to him about it. John was born healthy by all accounts, large and handsome. By the time he was 4 years old, in 1909, something had changed. He had experienced his first epileptic seizure. He was described by those around him as becoming painfully slow. His development lagged in ways that set him apart from his siblings. He didn't attend his parents' coronation on 22 June 1911. The official reason was the risk to his health, though some observers noted that the family also feared what a public incident might cost them. His epilepsy worsened through childhood. His seizures became more frequent and more severe. No official portrait of him was commissioned after 1913. By 1916, when he was 11, the family moved him on a permanent basis to Wood Farm, a secluded farmhouse on the edge of the Sandringham estate. His primary carer was Charlotte Jane Bill, known to the children as Lala, who had been with the family since April 1897 and had nursed John devotedly since his birth. She had arrived as an under-nurse at York Cottage, reported her predecessor's physical abuse of the young princes Edward and Albert, and been promoted to head nurse following that woman's dismissal. She was with John at Wood Farm until the end. He kept a small household. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, maintained a special garden at Sandringham House for him. Mary arranged for local children to be brought in as playmates. One was Winifred Thomas, the niece of a groom at the royal stables, with whom John cycled around the estate and worked in the garden. His brother, Prince George, visited. A photograph taken at Wood Farm in 1918 shows John with his dog, 1 year before his death. On Christmas Day, 1918, he came to Sandringham House to spend the holiday with his family, then was driven back to Wood Farm that same night. She arranged playmates. She visited. She didn't bring him home. He died on 18 January 1919 at Wood Farm, following a severe epileptic seizure. He was 13. His parents weren't present at the moment of death. Lala Bill telephoned to tell them. They motored down from the main house to find, as Mary recorded in her diary, poor Lala very resigned but heartbroken, and little Johnny looking very peaceful lying there. The diary entry continues. A great shock, though, for the poor little boy's restless soul, death came as a great relief. His father described the death as the greatest mercy possible. Both parents used the same idiom, mercy, relief, peaceful, a religiously framed vocabulary for parental suffering that had no other available language. The fuller register of Mary's feeling appears in the letter she wrote to her friend Emily Alcock shortly afterward. She wrote that for him it was a great relief, as his malady was becoming worse as he grew older, and he had thus been spared much suffering. She couldn't say how grateful they felt to God for having taken him in such a peaceful way. He just slept quietly into his heavenly home. No pain, no struggle, just peace for the poor little troubled spirit, which had been a great anxiety to them for many years, ever since he was 4 years old. The letter isn't cold. It's grief in the register available to a woman who had spent decades subordinating every personal feeling to institutional necessity. Pious resignation, not indifference. What the letter can't change is the structure. He was removed from the family at 11. He spent his final years in a farmhouse on the estate of the family that bore his name, cared for by his nurse rather than his mother. His funeral was held on 21 January 1919 at St. Mary Magdalene Church, Sandringham. His parents attended. Every person on the estate went and stood around the gates. His grave was covered in flowers. Mary's final diary reference to him was simple. Miss the dear child very much indeed. Lala Bill kept a portrait of him above her mantelpiece for the rest of her life, alongside a letter he had written her that read, Nanny, I love you, Johnny. The British Epileptic Association, responding to public scrutiny of John's treatment in later decades, stated plainly, there was nothing unusual in what they did. At that time, people with epilepsy were put apart from the rest of the community. They were often put in epilepsy colonies or mental institutions. It was thought to be a form of mental illness. The association added that it was another 20 years before the idea that epileptics shouldn't be segregated began to take hold. John's treatment was atypical in its structure. The feeling behind it's a different question, and one the documents don't fully resolve. The eldest brother's response is less ambiguous. Edward, 11 years John's senior and, by his own account, someone who had hardly known the boy, wrote a letter after the death that Queen Mary never replied to. He later felt obliged to apologize, writing that no one could realize more than she how little poor Johnny had meant to him who had hardly known him. The apology was worse than the original offense. John had been filed away. His death was, in Edward's register, little more than a regrettable nuisance. It was the kind of letter that Mary would have received without a single visible change of expression, folded and set aside, and never acknowledged directly. That was how she carried things. The acquisitive habit arrived earlier in the public imagination than most of the rest of this. Across the years, she called on aristocratic homes. A pattern developed. She would admire an object, a piece of jade, a piece of silver, a painting, and her hosts understood that royal admiration was a demand framed as a compliment. Objects were moved before she arrived. Houses were prepared. The more dramatic versions of this practice are difficult to corroborate with specific named transactions. Pope Hennessy's private research notes, published posthumously in The Quest for Queen Mary, edited by Hugo Vickers, are honest about this. What is documented is the scale of her appetite. She added more than 2,000 paintings, books, photographs, and decorative art objects to the royal collection, including a significant collection of Chinese jade and hardstones. She called collecting her one great hobby. In 1909, she sighed over a recently purchased group of silver candelabra bearing the cipher of George IV. Oh dear, if only I could find the history of all these things, how interesting it would be. But alas, there is no inventory, nothing. The appetite was real. Its social consequences were the aristocracy's private problem. At Badminton, where she spent the war years as a guest of the Duke and Duchess of Beaufort, the habits crystallized into something legendary. She arrived with a retinue of more than 50 staff and effectively took over the house, confining the Duke and Duchess to 2 bedrooms for the duration. She pulled ivy from the walls in all weathers, 2 o'clock until 5 o'clock, every day, until one of her ladies-in-waiting lost a wedding ring in the process and her secretary broke his wrist. She set her eye on a great cedar in the garden, one of the beauties of the place, the Duchess recalled, and it required the household's sustained collective effort to keep her away from it until Germany surrendered. Pope Hennessy recorded the Duchess's summary of her 2 ruling passions. The 2 things she liked most were destruction and order. The woman who organized Badminton and the woman who organized the Sandringham farmhouse were operating from the same set of instincts. The world divided into what served the institution and what didn't, and she acted accordingly in every room she entered. In 1917, that same logic operated at a more consequential level. Tsar Nicholas II, deposed in the Russian Revolution in March of that year, was owed, in some basic dynastic sense, consideration by his British cousins. A tentative offer of asylum had been extended. The British government, under Prime Minister Lloyd George, moved to withdraw it. The fear was genuine. Sheltering an autocratic cousin might inflame working-class sentiment in a country already strained by 3 years of war. George V, under ministerial pressure, let the offer lapse. Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed at Yekaterinburg in July 1918. What Queen Mary's personal position on the asylum question was isn't documented. Kenneth Rose, in his biography of George V, attributes the decision to the king, driven by government pressure. To assign it elsewhere is to contradict the available record. It's one of the dynasty's unresolved wounds, and if Mary held a private feeling that differed from her husband's, she took it with her. Fort Belvedere, 10 December 1936. Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication, witnessed by his 3 younger brothers, renouncing the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, twice divorced, American, and entirely unacceptable to the institution. Queen Mary had refused to receive her. She never would. The abdication was, by the testimony of those who spoke to Pope Hennessy, the worst thing that ever happened to her. According to the Duchess of Shaftesbury, she was passionately devoted to the Prince of Wales, more so than to any of her other children, and felt his decision as both a personal and a national betrayal. He had put desire before duty, which was, to Mary, not a choice she could comprehend from the inside. The day before the abdication took effect, Albert drove to London to see his mother. He wrote in his diary, "When I told her what had happened, I broke down and sobbed like a child." George VI, as the nervous second son became, was carrying a stammer he'd had since around age 6, had spent a decade in speech therapy with Lionel Logue, and was by every account unready for the crown. Queen Mary's work in the months and years after December 1936 was to steady him. She attended his coronation on 12 May 1937, breaking with tradition to show public support, the first dowager queen to attend a successor's coronation in modern times. She wrote to Edward, after the abdication was done, making clear that he had failed his duty. She made no accommodation for his happiness. The same woman who had not counterbalanced George V's harshness toward her children had iron enough, when the institution required it, to give without limit or hesitation. The coldness that had failed her sons in the nursery was the identical quality that held the crown together in December 1936. Those aren't two separate stories. They never were. The Duke of Windsor visited Marlborough House twice on the day she died. He arrived for a third visit 10 minutes after she was gone. Her daughter, the Princess Royal, had been at her side through the final hours. The bulletins had gone out through the day, a hemorrhage in the morning, condition more grave by the afternoon, sleeping peacefully by 7 o'clock, and at 10:20, she died. Winston Churchill informed the House of Commons shortly before 11:15. Her banner over Marlborough House was lowered. Nearly 120,000 mourners filed past her coffin when it lay in state at Westminster Hall between 29 and 31 March 1953. She was buried beside George V in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, beneath a monumental sarcophagus with effigies of both of them sculpted by Sir William Reed Dick. She was Queen Mary for 43 years and Queen Dowager for 17 more. And in all that time, the country saw exactly what she meant it to see: the unbending spine of a monarchy that survived a world war, a depression, and a king who walked away. What it didn't see was a small boy behind a hedge at Sandringham, or the guests who hid their treasures before she arrived, or the sons who learned from her that to feel was to be weak. She asked that her death not delay a coronation, and it didn't. The pillar held to the very end. That was always the point. It was also the price. If stories like this one are what you come here for, subscribe. There are more of them.